Welcome to BWI Live. We're discussing Penn State class of 2026 from top to bottom. What it has right now, what it needs, and what it could look like. All that coming up on the show today, plus your questions, comments, concerns, praises, all those things on the show. Sean Fitz here with me today. Ryan Snyder taking a well-deserved vacation, so he is off for today. So it's me and Fitz holding it down. Of course, Fitz mostly holding it down. Fitz, how you doing today?
I'm fantastic. Yeah, Ryan's off for the weekend. Well-deserved. Based on all the knowledge that's been dropped in the last couple of days, he's running a chat, by the way, on bluewhiteillustrated.com. You should definitely check that out. It's fantastic. Centered around recruiting. We do our Friday chat, but it's often skewed in football, and Nate gets in there and talks basketball, and you talk film and all that kind of stuff. So just to have a dedicated recruiting chat where you can interact with the staff, interact with whatever you want to talk about, it's pretty great. So check that out if you're on bluewhiteillustrated.com. If you're not on bluewhiteillustrated.com, get on bluewhiteillustrated.com. Just $1 a month, $1 a week. Check it out for a full year. I think you're going to be pleased with the coverage that we have of Penn State football, Penn State basketball, who, by the way, since we took him to task on the show on Tuesday, I think the message got across. Nate must have passed the word along to Mike Rhodes. A big win last night over Nebraska. So congratulations to those guys for, I don't know about getting back on track, but at least getting a win, because that was pretty ugly there for a little bit. So everything is happening at bluewhiteillustrated.com. I know it's the off season, but I've said this before. The off season's oftentimes more interesting than the regular season, because it's not as routine. It's not, you go out there and you do your film stuff afterwards, and we recap the visitors and stuff like that. But it's kind of a grab bag lightning round in the off season. So definitely check us out, bluewhiteillustrated.com. I cannot recommend it enough. For obvious reasons, but for the biggest reason is it's the best Penn State football coverage anywhere. Check us out.
And same thing here for the show. Like, during the season, there's things we have to get to. We have so much information, so much stuff that Penn State fans want to know about. This is a time to kind of step back and have some of the big picture conversations. I love having those with you and Nate and Ryan and Greg, because I feel like, again, the perspective that we have is awesome, and we have the time to breathe. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. That's really what it is, a big picture view of 2026 and Penn State football recruiting. But the first thing is, on the horizon is some big changes to college football in general, something we've talked about. You've talked about quite a bit here, the run-on situation with players across the country, not just at Penn State, but with the House settlement eliminating scholarships, that eliminates the walk-on status, essentially. You wrote a great article over on the site. Go read it. Not you, Fitz, you wrote it, but like people watching, go read it. What was your discussion with some of those second-year players who have that stuff to think about and worry about in the future beyond just, am I playing football?
Yeah, I think it's important to start with the sort of background. The House settlement that's in front of, it's set to be either approved or denied in, I think, April. And the more people I talk to, the less confident I am that it all gets done. I think there's more adjustments that need to be made. But the main thing when you're talking about college football, and at least this level of college football, is you're talking about a roster cap of 105. So that's not necessarily it's tough to understand, because you're going to go from 85 scholarships to 105 scholarships. Now, we've talked in the last couple of cycles that the math is all creative, and you can get above 85 by doing that creative math. But so yes, adding 20 scholarships, fantastic. Great. The ability to add 20 scholarships, right. But also taking down the roster from, they got 121 guys on there right now, without adding the guys that are coming in for the spring, for the summer, whatever it may be. So you're talking about cutting 30 guys, and that's not, that doesn't sit well with me. I mean, it's one of those things where, yes, I understand that more opportunities will be there on the scholarship end, but I don't think people understand how much of the team these walk-ons are, or how much of a part of the team these walk-ons guys are. I mean, we had a conversation this morning on our board about, well, you get 6 or 7 of them on the field, and them on Saturdays, but throughout the week, I mean, these guys they're right there. They're lifting, they're doing all the things that the scholarship guy is doing. They're paying to do it. But they're vital parts of the team. Penn State's got one of the proudest walk-on traditions in the country. So to take it down to 105, a hard cap, that's an issue. Like, that is something that will change quite a bit. And again, I don't understand the rush to get there. I don't understand the number in itself. I think it's just a facade. Like, I think it's just made up. I don't think there's any proof that says that a 105 roster is good for
Yeah.
or good for anybody. And then
Yeah. Is there any conversation about how we landed on 105? Does this have to, and how does all that tie into Title IX? I know I'm asking questions. I'm not necessarily asking you those questions, but those are where my mind goes to. Are those, because the numbers before were tied to Title IX. If you're trying to move around that particular conversation with doing away with scholarships, yeah, why 105? That's not a number that you're just kind of pulling that out of no place in football is 105 a number.
yeah, and it doesn't. Like I said, I think it's a figment of someone's imagination. It's a meet in the middle number is what it is, and you're getting a situation where you're going to run into practice squads. The issue with, or the biggest issue with the 105 number is in college football. If a guy gets hurt, done for the season, blows out a knee, whatever, you now have a 104 man roster because you can't go out and sign somebody. Like the NFL, they can find bodies, they can make it work. Whereas college football is a different entity. It's a different sort of workflow. It's, you're a practice squad for a reason, and these guys take a ton of pride in that, and they absolutely should. But you're looking at a sense where you can't replace them. Now, I think there are hybrid models that make sense. Like, you can have a cap that's 120 guys, but you're probably going to have a practice squad, quote unquote, air quotes, practice squad of 15 guys where you can add from, where you can make this work, where you get a guy that's a red shirt guy and maybe you pull him back and put him on the practice squad because it's not working out, or he has an injury or something like that is sort of like a destabilized type thing. So, but then again, you got to convince guys to join your roster at this point. It's been very fascinating to watch because I covered Bill O'Brien's teams where they had 65 scholarships or whatever, 15 scholarships a year. And then you bring in 20 walk-on guys, and those guys would make up a big chunk of your roster. Now I think they brought in Matthew Parker, the kicker from Central York, as a walk-on in the midterm. And there's not too many other guys out there that are going to jump on board, which I don't blame them. I wouldn't suggest it right now. Ty Salazar from State College. We've seen him in person. I think he can play at this level. He's going to Delaware. He signed with Delaware. I think he's going to do really well at Delaware. But that was a guy that you targeted as a potential guy that can get on the field for you as a walk-on. Now, I think those things are going away. So the other issue is, yes, you've got 7-8 walk-ons that make a difference. I listed them in the story, and I can't really say them off the top of my head, but a lot of specialists, a lot of special teams contributors, a lot of guys that are, and Dom Ruley played in all 16 games last year for Penn State, backup center. You have to whittle them down from 30, 40 guys to get 6 or 7, and you don't know which ones are going to hit. Like, you didn't know Dom DeLuca was going to hit when he got in here. Penn State felt really good about him, but at the same time, he's going to be a walk-on getting into a scholarship or like a full scholarship program. So you don't know how it's going to work. So yes, those guys can still make it. It's going to be very tough. And Penn State, the way that they would handle this situation with 105 is to take 95-ish scholarship guys and fill out the rest of the roster with kickers, long snappers, punters, maybe some one-off skill players or things like that. I think it'd be very tough. And with the transfer portal, with opt-outs, with all that kind of stuff, it really makes it difficult. Because you think about this. We're a few years removed from basically not having a spring game because Penn State didn't have enough offensive linemen. Remember that? That was rough. That was rough. Now, you could find yourself in a situation where these guys on the offensive line, that third team, that fourth team of mostly walk-ons or all walk-ons, like they get you through some situations. And if you're a scholarship guy that's in your second or third year and you see that you're not going to play, like, you're not sticking around for that. So these guys, I don't want to call them space fillers, but these guys do a heck of a job in patching holes in that roster that need
they fill critical needs, right? Of somebody who's competent enough to create competition and development for your players. And while it's not a glamorous position, it is one where it's invaluable. And kind of like to give the practice squad in the NFL is filled with guys that are really good at football, but maybe aren't good enough to be in the top 1% of all football players that have played football.
Right.
That doesn't mean they're not in the top 2%. And at this level, like, there's steps down as well. It's a conversation about, we get a lot of things where people who don't understand what what they're trying to adjudicate start making rules for people who have to then live with those rules. And it seems like we get a lot of that, of like people so far removed from the situation and making rules that they don't really know what they're doing.
Right. Yeah, no, that makes sense. And Brad asked a question here. He's talking about the 105. Could a guy on a track scholarship come and play football? Now, so football is at the top of the hierarchy when you're talking about scholarships here. So like if you're a basketball player and a football player, like you're going to count against football. Like if you're a track guy, Dan Chisena was a track guy, like you're going to count against football if you have that full scholarship. It is not, I don't think that's one of the creative math things that we're talking about here. So basically if you're a scholarship athlete, if you're a hockey player and you want to play football, like it's going to count against football just because that's the way that it is set up, and it makes sense. Like it would be a heck of a workaround. I mean, this is not really something that I don't think is spent too much time on, but like, yeah,
that would endear yourself to all the other coaches on the campus if you're taking scholarships from the wrestling team so that you can have an extra defensive lineman who is like a heavyweight. That would be, that would a lot of people would really start to love the football program if they just start eating other parts of the organization as well.
Yeah, or like it's just, yeah, that's how that works. And by the way, speaking of wrestling, I got my prediction right. Penn State won this past weekend, so pretty proud of myself for putting that out there. And
what about this upcoming weekend? There's another one for you.
I think they're going to win. I haven't checked the schedule to see if they have a match, but I'm going to put my thoughts behind Penn State there, because I know they got some injuries and things like that, but they're still pretty good. I think the rankings came out and they were number 1 or 2 at 8 weight classes.
Yeah, 8 to 10.
So very, very much slacking at those other 2, I guess.
Yeah, and if you want more information on that, the wrestling show with myself and Greg Pickle came out yesterday on the Blue White Illustrated YouTube channel, 5 o'clock every Wednesday during the off season for football. And then when we had that combo of football and wrestling, we put it out on Thursdays. But all you need to know right now, wrestling Wednesdays at 5 p.m. is when you can check out that show. This show
top of Google right now. So if you Google Penn State wrestling, you can see the Penn State wrestling show right there on top of it. So great job by you guys getting it up there.
That's all Greg. Greg is a maestro at all of these things and is the star of the show. This show is brought to you by My Perfect Franchise. Andy Ludicky and My Perfect Franchise, a longtime sponsor here on the Recruiting Show. If you have the skills necessary to run your own business, make your own money, determine your own future, and you're looking for a way out of your corporate rat race life, Andy's been in that position. And he wants to share his expertise of franchise management with you. He takes you through the whole process from the very beginning of, hey, what is franchise management? How does it work? All the way through, what franchise would I want to manage? And then into the nitty-gritty details of, hey, you've met with the franchise. He goes with you to, let's say it's in California where the corporate headquarters are. He'll hold your hand through the entire thing to give you an understanding of the information you just learned and how to best apply it to your situation. All the way through the process. It's 100% free to you if you go to myperfectfranchise.net. You sign up. Now, again, the thing he wants to stress is this isn't for everybody, and it's not every situation he's going to just throw you into any business to get you placed and then moved on off of his calendar. He wants to find the right situation so you can be successful. So you have a certain number of skills in a certain area. Maybe you are an expert in a trade and you want to have the business experience and you want to grow whatever that is. I'm just making these things up. Whether there's whatever's happening in your life or the economy, there's always some part of business that is growing and expanding. 404-973-9901. And Andy is an expert on that stuff as well. Appreciate him being here on the show. He's also a massive fan of recruiting and baseball. So if people from the Blue White Illustrated ecosphere, if they buy into a franchise, he'll donate to the NIL Collective for baseball. So you want Penn State baseball to kick things into high gear. You want that sport to grow here at Penn State. And I mean, just all makes sense, right? You're a Penn State fan. You're a person who has business experience. Talk to Andy. It's free. It can't hurt you. The next part of the show, I'm really excited to hear Fitz's view of the class of 2026. Now, right now they have 9 commits. We're going to go through a check-in in just a little bit, but I wanted to take this class in relation to what's available and what they need, because as much as Fitz has said, I think even on the Tuesday show just this week, that you're looking at things on a year-to-year projection. You're not doing a 4-year projection anymore because of all the things that have changed. Roster building is cumulative. So if you can address situations, can you build talent at a certain position, rebuild talent at a position? Where are those spots in this particular class? So based on the Penn State roster and maybe some expected departures for 2026, what do you think are the positions critical to restocking in 2026, Fitz? Muted.
All of them, since you built it up like that, because yes, you're stacking right now. You're in a spot where you're trying to reload versus rebuild, and there's some positions where you certainly are going to have questions, and there's going to be some positions that sort of go in cycles, and then of course there's going to be wide receiver, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, multiple times today. But no, you gotta sort of strike while the iron's hot and figure out what your best bet is, especially in the region. Penn State, for all the national recruiting that's done over the last couple of cycles, is going to be a footprint program. When you're talking about recruiting, it's going to be Pennsylvania, it's going to be Jersey, Maryland, Virginia, New York, maybe a little bit into Ohio, West Virginia. They got Daniel Jennings committed from West Virginia. Then, of course, New England. I think New England's resurgence over the last several years has been really cool. The prep schools have done a really good job up there in terms of getting talent, and Penn State is has benefited from that as well. But you look at what's available for Penn State in the region. I think defensive line leads the way. You've got some guys that are really, really top level defensive line prospects, whether the rankings say it or not right now. But in Jersey, you got Damari Simeon, you got Alex Haskell at defensive tackle, but DN's like really interesting. You've got 2 guys at Gonzaga in DC. You've got Jackson Samuels Ford, who set up an official visit in Pennsylvania. So you just offered Ashton Blatt at Pittsburgh Central Catholic. You've got a lot of numbers there. And that's never, I don't want to say it's never the case, but it's usually not the case. So a lot of schools have taken notice. A lot of offer lists have built up over the last couple of months by taking notice of that.
Fitz, are you still with us? Hold on 1 second. It seems as if something has happened to Fitz's microphone. So give me 1 second and see if did that fix it, Fitz? Oh, maybe it's on my end. Well, we're going to address this here on the Blue White Illustrated YouTube show. I'm Thomas Frank Carr, Sean Fitz on the other end. If you can hear us, by the way, in the chat, something just happened in the software, and we are unsure if you can hear us because this has happened every once in a while with this particular software that we use, where there's a problem with something that goes on live in the show. So we're going to get back to Fitz's thoughts here in this class in particular, and then we're going to talk about some of the players that I've scouted over the last couple of days and weeks over at bluewhiteillustrated.com. It's recruiting season, and the thing I find interesting when we talk about the different players that you watch, and a lot of this is built off of highlights. Okay, it looks like Fitz does not have power right now, which is amazing that he was able to be on with us, but he does not have power. So we're going to see what happens with Fitz over the next couple of minutes. We're going to pivot hard to a different conversation, as I mentioned, about some of the players that I've scouted recently at bluewhiteillustrated.com. Some of those being defensive linemen, as we were just talking about some of them in the region, some of those guys adding context to what Fitz was talking about with edge rushers and defensive tackles, because I think it is an interesting part of this particular class when it comes to how Penn State needs to restock at that particular position. So let's talk about a guy like Brian Harris. Brian Harris just offered from down in Florida at Mandarin High School. Brian Harris is a super interesting prospect, and I think this is part of this conversation of having 105, no limits on a particular class in terms of scholarship. Brian Harris is a very intriguing prospect from a traits perspective. So a guy who I think is on the radar for a specific reason. I wanted to pull him up here. We talked about him earlier on the show this week. I wanted to pull this up here from Brian Harris. 6'4", 290-ish pounds. When you look at him on film, a guy that is well built, really well filled out for a guy that size. The interesting part is he is a defensive end sometimes at the Mandarin defense, and then sometimes plays on the inside, on the interior. So Penn State loves these tweener guys, right? So they love guys that are part defensive end, part defensive tackle at the high school level because they want athletes at this particular position. The part that I've found interesting is that he plays a lot more defensive tackle, and he's bigger than a lot of the guys that Penn State has recruited recently at that particular position in this particular style. But he doesn't necessarily play like it. A lot of his moves, a lot of his abilities are all kind of built around speed and fluidity, despite his size. A guy that doesn't play the run really well right now, a great athlete, but does not play up to that big size. So whether he's 290 pounds or he's 280 pounds or 275, you can see he's a well-built football player. So he really fits what Penn State wants from that defensive tackle position and has more of these translatable skills and situations than some of the guys that we've seen from Penn State. But on the other side, doesn't have some of the run defense characteristics for somebody who is his particular size. There's also some pad level issues, some movement skills that look good, but don't necessarily translate fully throughout his film. So I think when you talk about Penn State's defensive tackle room and the regional guys, Penn State should still focus on those. And I know everyone gets excited about, hey, here's a Florida defensive tackle, right? Everyone wants, those guys down south that are going to be in that mold of somebody that everybody wants. I think everybody's going to want Brian Harris if he continues to develop, but there's a pretty raw side to what he is right now. And I went into detail on this, so I did a full game breakdown at bluewhiteillustrated.com on the message board if you want to check that out. Also have, watch his highlights and all of those things. So Brian Harris, I think, is an interesting part of this conversation when we talk about those regional defensive tackles that Fitz was discussing, and then some of the talent and potential outside the region. And that gets into, I think, Fitz, the part of this class you were talking about with 2 to 4 defensive tackles, right? You mentioned 2 to 4 defensive tackles, what's in region, and then, some of the guys that they can pull maybe from out of the region to take that number a little bit higher. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think when I say 2 to 4 defensive tackles, and I apologize, I think I blew a fuse or something in this room because I walked out of this room and all the lights were on. So I'm not sure what the heck happened. I think my puppy may have chewed on something she shouldn't have. Anyway, no, I'm looking at 2 to 4, and 4 is a lot. And they took 4 in the class of 2024, and they've lost 1. They've replenished it with Owen Wafel, and that's a lot. But like those big bodies, you never know how they're going to take when they get to the college level. So if you've got the opportunity to take that many prospects, especially in this region, in the class of 2026, I think you got to do everything you can to do that. James Franklin has not turned away quality talent on either line. Like I think we talk about this sometimes with guys that they aren't sure on. Okay, well, if you are sure on them, you're gonna have a spot. Like, and that's kind of the difference there. Is like if you're not sure on a guy, like, and you don't want to press, that's one thing. But if you feel like this guy can play here and you feel like this guy has a lot of upside here, they're gonna take him. So that's why I have a number like 4, because it is a lot, yes, but those guys are gonna be in the region. Like if you can get Damari Simeon and Alex Haskell, and then we talked about Carter Gooden, Brian Harris, and there's a bunch of names that are sort of festering on that line that you could take. Yeah, I think you just kind of throw numbers at it. And with the roster expansion happening, like I think you can add 1, maybe 2 to every number that you think about to sort of balance it out and make it work. So it's just the best of what's around, really. Like, and I think that they've got an opportunity here in defensive tackle that you don't get often in the Northeast. We've talked about that on the show before. Like a lot of these guys come from the Southeast. A lot of these guys come from the Carolinas, Texas, Louisiana, sometimes Florida as well. You've got to find those guys and convince them to come up to Pennsylvania. It's easier to do that if they already live in Pennsylvania or New Jersey or New England.
So with a guy, and just this is kind of a conversation that Eggman has in the chat and what I've been wondering, but just generally with examples like T.A. Cunningham and Liam Andrews deciding he wants to play defensive tackle over offensive line. Is there a thought about trying to take a couple of flyers on guys maybe that aren't as sure in terms of we see these characteristics in Penn State defensive linemen? big body guys. They play on the edge. They obviously are going to grow into a defensive tackle, but might not be the biggest guys in the world. And then you got a guy like Brian Harris, who's 6'4" and has, all of the tools that you would want along that line. You're going to prioritize a Damari Simeon or an Alex Haskell or somebody that you feel very strongly about. But then, if there's a guy out there that has traitsy upside, why not try and hit on that guy and add a little bit of size into the room? It seems like that is something that I know Penn State fans want. I'm curious if there's a trend towards that with maybe a little bit more flexibility, as you've been talking about with numbers.
I think so. And I think there's no sort of, blueprint for how this is going to work, whether the guy is 6'4", whether Zane Durant's 6'1". Like it's one of those things where you got to find the athleticism. And I know there's conversation in the chat here about taking the guys like Alabama and Georgia. And I think, you would if you could. You remember like Devin Still was one of those guys at one point, Jared Odrick, like those big guys that just are huge.
Yeah.
Maybe not the Jordan Davis 350-pound type, but they're big guys. And there's not a lot of those floating around anymore. And a lot of them play offensive line now. So
and also they can move. So there's no Alabama or Georgia defensive tackle that is 340 pounds and is immobile.
Right.
That Kirby Smart is very specific about over the last decade. His defense has gotten smaller and more athletic. So those guys that you're thinking of that are 340 pounds, they're 320 pounds and they run like Penn State defensive tackles. Everybody wants those guys anyway. So the comparison doesn't necessarily, Jalen Carter is an elite athlete. He's not just a big football player.
Jalen Carter. You're right. Absolutely.
Great idea.
The where Penn State fits on the scale on this tier of college football, like those guys are going to a certain spot. Those guys have, and to Alabama and Georgia's credit, those guys have been developed at places like that. So like it's tough to look at, or not tough to look at, but it's tough to break into that echelon, even though Penn State's defensive line has been as successful as anybody's.
You have on here that you think safety is an interesting position this time around. What do you mean by that?
I think it's very interesting because if you watched BlueWhiteIllustrated.com, if you watched On 3 this week, like a couple of names popped up that weren't necessarily like on our radar. And I think that's a testament to Anthony Poindexter. And I think it's a testament to the interest level in playing in a defense that's been as highly rated as Penn State has been over the last couple of years. You got Matt Sieg committed, still after Caden Gephardt, of course. Joey O'Brien is a huge target for Penn State, but now you've got a couple new official visits. Guy Caden Hall is number 24 overall nationally, number 2 safety. He's from the Florida Panhandle, kind of in Bama's shadow. So like he's going to have some great options there, but Penn State's going to get an official visit. Jordan Deck, number 293 nationally, number 23 safety from Texas, is going to be up in June, I believe. Or they've actually started this is a completely different thing that they haven't done before, but official visits on the weekend of May 18th, which is the weekend, or May 16th to 18th, which is the weekend that the Elite 11, the All 22s in town. Joey O'Brien actually just set up an official visit for that weekend. So that's a new one. But no, safety is just very interesting to me because you look at the quality that Penn State has had, and I mean, you think back 10 years and it's come a long way. It's like corner. It's come a long way into Penn State. And now I'm not sure that you have the national pull to pull a guy like Caden Hall, but Jordan Deck, who is not quite at that tier, but also a heck of a football player. Maybe you've got an opportunity.
Also, shocker. He's 6'3". Like again, another big safety with range.
Another big safety. Yeah. And Poindexter has kind of ironed out what he wants. And you see that in the guys that he offers and the guys that they eventually pursue. And, like I said, offer lists are what they are at this point, but getting official visits is a big deal because you've only got a few of them. I know they're unlimited now, but you've only got a certain amount of time where you can make this happen. So to get those guys on campus, I think it's massive. And it's a puncher's chance situation, of course. But at the same time, like you need to be in the ring to have a puncher's chance.
Yeah, that's a great point. When it comes to the rest of the class, regional targets, defensive end, you mentioned Daniel Jennings already on board. Linebacker is an interesting one because it feels like this is a really good, diverse linebacker group. And I know that Penn State fans feel a little bit uneasy with great reason right now that there's kind of a transitionary period after Kobe King. Not that the class of 2026 is going to impact this upcoming season, but just making sure you're restocking the pantry at linebacker. What's your view of where they sit with that particular group?
A lot of linebackers on board. Kind of like safety, you kind of know the household names in the region. Put in a pick for Matthew Canoe a couple of weeks ago. Nick Abrams is there. Terry Wiggins set up an official visit. Kid from Coatesville. So you've got an idea of what they've got in the in sort of in the chamber here in the region. But I think they're going to have some national guys as well. Like there's going to be some guys that folks on BlueWhiteIllustrated.com might recognize the name, but like guys that come out of nowhere, like those guys, like those safeties did yesterday, who set up official visits to Penn State. So feeling pretty strong about Penn State's potential to get those in there. Again, I got a pick in for Matthew Canoe. I think Terry Wiggins makes a ton of sense. Like this kid, 6'3", 215, has got a condor wingspan. You know, it's one of those guys that Penn State's had a lot of success with, and I think he's a guy athletic enough to stick at linebacker. Nick Abrams is at McDonough, but he's going to go down to Georgia. He's going to go to Oregon. He's going to go to Alabama. He's going to go to a lot of places. And I think that, you know, Penn State will be in the conversation as long as it will go on. But yeah, it's going to be a tough one there for Nick Abrams. So yeah, I'm very encouraged by what's in the region. And that's why when we talk about Penn State's potential for a top 10 class in 2026, like you have to lean on those guys. You got to finish on the top guys, but you have to lean on what's in the region, what's in the position, or who's available at the strongest positions that you've had. And with them trying to fill out this class on defense, I think it makes sense that you've got those guys in the region.
The next part of this that we're going to hit on here are the guys that are important, right, in the region. And this gets into the class of 2026 being top 10, that whole conversation everyone wants to know about. They want you to guarantee them that this class will end up in the top 10. For a lot of fans that want that, obviously, for the health and the long-term part of the program. Who are the guys that you think are important to just generally having a successful regional approach, as you mentioned, and getting the guys that are critical on board?
All right. If you're listening, watching, doing whatever on this podcast, I want you to hang with me here. I'm going to put Manny Ihenacho and Zion Ali to the side. Like 5-star prospects, everybody's after them, all that kind of stuff. They're like, nobody's a must get. There's no such thing as a must get in recruiting. Those guys will be tough to get. Penn State will be in it, I think, to the end for both of those guys. So we're going to put them in a bucket to the side. And I think you look at sort of what I would call linchpin guys that make sense for Penn State, guys that fit into that sweet spot where Penn State is maybe not at the very top of the list, at least for NIL, for all the things that could convince the top guys to come here. I think realistic targets that make a ton of sense. I'll start with Kari Adams, a cornerback from Maryland. Again, a Brandon Finney redux, a guy that they have had on campus multiple times. They were early on. They were, you know, just kind of building that relationship almost before anybody else. And they've been consistently at or near the top of his list. So Kari Adams is a guy that we're obviously, you and I think are very high on him.
Yep.
He's got the physical attributes to go with it. He's got the track times. He's got everything that you like. And I also think he's an awesome kid. So like, you kind of want him in your program. So Kari Adams is the first guy I go to. He was very high on our big board that we released earlier this month on BlueWhiteIllustrated.com, just below Joey O'Brien, who, as we mentioned earlier, has set up an official visit to Penn State. It's an interesting date because it's that May 16th weekend. Will that stick? I'm not 100% sure, because I think that he had planned on being in the All-22 Elite 11 showcase that's in State College that weekend. So maybe you work around it, and maybe that one finds a different date at some point. I'll say that. But Joey O'Brien, tremendously important. Penn State recruiting him as an athlete with a tendency to go safety. Tom Allen just offered him at Clemson. Clemson's got his attention as well. So like these are battles, like and that's what I keep going back to. If you have top talent, elite talent in your region, and they're not necessarily like the Ihenacho, the elite guys, like you're not going to win them all. Like you're going to battle as much as you can. You're going to win some of them. You're going to lose some of them. So I'm very curious to see where Penn State ends up on guys that really fit the program, like Adams, like Joey O'Brien. So I think it's going to be a stomach churning couple of months. So that's why I hope you're along with us on BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. I also have Damari Simeon, the defensive tackle from South Jersey. When you look at recruiting, you try to not tell the same story over and over again, but you try and find these logical data points that point to Penn State. I think Damari Simeon is one of those.
Yep.
Now,
Yep.
he has blown up like crazy. Just got the Ohio State offer not too long ago. But he's been back to Penn State several times, came to the SMU playoff game. I think that's a harbinger of good things for the group that did make it to that game, the small group, but they did make it to that game. And yeah, I think he makes a ton of sense for Penn State, especially with Deion Barnes, a young position coach there, especially with the guys that he's connected with on the recruiting staff. They make sense. So those three guys, and we're talking about filling out defense, and you got guys like Kevin Brown on offense and Jasir Rogers on offense and things like that. But those three guys on defense, I think, could be the centerpiece of Penn State's class if they close on them all, which as of right now, yeah, we'll very much wait and see, because we're in purgatory. We're waiting for those official visits to come along. We've seen a ton of official visits announced in the last couple of days. I don't think all of them will stick. I think that's just part of where we're at in the cycle and getting caught up with, hey, if you got to get your foot in the door, at least got to get a date right now. If that's subject to change, it's subject to change. Right. But like, there's going to be very, very busy times in May and June. July is dead. So right now, from February to mid-March, we're kind of sitting there treading water, and that's kind of what we have to do. But I think they've set themselves up pretty well. They've established those relationships to the point where it's going to make a lot of sense for a lot of kids to pick Penn State at some point.
Steven asked this: do they fit Knowles' scheme well? Yes. When you have as much talent as the players that Fitz is talking about, yes, you absolutely fit not Jim Knowles' scheme well. You fit Matt Patricia's scheme well. You fit the defense coordinator at Notre Dame's scheme well, Tom Allen. Yes, these players are scheme versatile. I would also say that Damari Simeon, it is a lazy comparison, but the conversation of the 6'2" defensive tackle, undersized defensive tackle, Penn State's had a lot of success with those guys, and that is regardless of the scheme, the way that Penn State wants to play with the attacking, penetrating style, that's attractive for guys that are dominantly physical and have the athleticism to play in this defense. Because Penn State emphasizes that, they get guys like Max Granville, who decide not only to commit early, but then to enroll early, because this defense and this defensive line culture is something that a lot of guys who have those skill sets that are very coveted usually are drawn to that. Now,
I have a question, T. Frank. This is putting you on the spot, which I love to do. Play role reversal here. What kind of guy doesn't fit Jim Knowles' scheme? Like, what is a body type? What is a play? Like, it's easier to say on offense, because you could say, oh, this is an option quarterback. He's not going to fit what this pro style system does. But like, the best defensive coordinators always go to personnel, right? Like they tailor their system around what they have. And in college football, you're not going out and signing an impact free agent. You've got to make that work. So what doesn't work for Jim Knowles, do you think?
So the question is, how are they tailoring this to Penn State's defense? Because James Franklin and Jim Knowles have had that conversation with us in the last month. I would say what doesn't fit is the super undersized guy, because controlling the box with fewer players is really important. So here's an interesting thing of just looking at some of the decisions they've made over time. They have played well-defined 1 technique and 3 technique at defensive tackle. They've played boundary and field. So Dennis Sutton fits perfectly into the archetype of 1 defensive end role. And then you got Zariah Fisher fits really well. Max Granville fits really well into that jack linebacker position or defensive end position. Are they doing all that stuff? They haven't really determined that. They aren't going to tell us that. We might see a little bit of it in practice, but that's kind of the big mystery to me. But when you talk about they need 6 players generally to be the guys controlling the box, I do wonder, Damari Simeon doesn't fit into this because he's explosively strong for his size, and he has the power to go along with a frame that's going to fill out to be 300 pounds. There's no problem with that. But a guy, I have a question about Zane Durant. If he's playing a role where the 3 technique in this defense typically plays the A gap more than I've seen, the more I watch it.
Right.
He's done that at Penn State because they don't differentiate between the two classically in this scheme. But over the long term, are those smaller guys preferable, or do you want guys that have more size? And that conversation, by the way, extends to linebacker as well. And you and I have talked about that. They're going to get the best players that fit the scheme, but I do think that the ability to play with control up front can be a differentiating factor. So as much as I'm talking, I feel like I'm talking out both sides of my mouth, because at this point, it is very undecided about whether or not they're going to lean in fully into Jim Knowles and what he's bringing from that all the way back to Oklahoma State side of things.
Right. And any time that there's a first year defensive coordinator, I mean, you basically have to staple together the first year, right? Like you got to figure out what you've got on hand, how that makes sense with, let's take safety, for example. You know, Zakee Wheatley is going to come back. You know that, or you believe that Dejon Lane is a guy that can take the next step. But what do you do after that, especially when you want to have three safeties? Is it King Mack? Is it Babu Torre? Is it all these guys that we've seen potential things for? But also when you play Jalen Reed 90% of the snaps, when you play Wheatley 90% of the snaps, when you expect to play KJ Winston 95% of the snaps, like you're going to have to reset at some point. You're going to have to rebuild, reload, whatever you want, restock. I think restock is like in between there, and it makes a lot of sense for that. But you're going to have question marks at spots like that because of it. So I think it's just a very fascinating conversation is how does Jim Knowles work for Penn State's players in year one, especially before he can sort of build out what he wants for the next couple of years.
Yeah. And that I think the conversation about those three safety spots I found interesting. I've written about it over at the site, and there's a lot of crossover in terms of what Penn State has done classically with that nickel position, but there are some differences that I think will make some of those distinctions, as you mentioned, stand out in this first year while they figure out who fits where best, because there's a lot of overlap too with those players. Of King Mack, you might say 5'9", and is a guy that's going to be a nickel defender because of his size and relative speed. But we've seen that didn't really work out for him. He's back at Penn State, probably could play two of the classic safety positions. And then you've got a couple of other guys that can fill in a bunch of different ways. So the last part of this before we get into, and we've discussed the official visits, so that'll be a quick thing here at the end of the show, but February has been quieter, I think, than previous Februarys. And I always just like to check in every once in a while in this recruiting process because a lot of people don't have the day-to-day, month-to-month understanding of how this rhythm goes. So I just wanted to check in here on the class of 2026, give some facts, give some details, and get some context from Fitz. We got the players, the who's. Now let's look at kind of the length of this, this process where it stands right now in this intermediary. How many... I'm going to start with this and then we'll get to some of the facts. How many recruits does Penn State normally get verbal commitments from in February? It feels like off the top of my head, we usually have 2 or 3 coming off the back of those January official junior days. There haven't been any at this point, right? Has there one in February?
One. Yeah.
Okay.
You usually probably have 2 or 3 coming off of junior days. And as we said, coming out of the junior days, like it wasn't the most explosive list of players that they had on board. I think it was an okay list from in the grand scheme of things. And I think that they'll get guys that were here. But no, Julian Peterson's the only one coming out of the junior days that have committed. I don't sense there's a ton in the next couple of weeks. March is interesting. It's really sort of when you look back at the last couple of classes, when it hits, it starts rolling, but this was not it for Penn State. Peterson was not the tip of the iceberg, if you will. But you think about a couple of cycles ago, Luke Reynolds was that guy, but he was late March. So you found yourself going on these runs at different times. And it hasn't worked out for Penn State in February. I don't get the sense that there's guys that they are pressing with right now to make it happen. And I also think that the money aspect has something to do with this. You're sort of waiting out these official visits because as the player, it gives you a chance to not only see the school that you potentially want to go to, but also gives you some leverage and trying to figure out how to maximize the deal that you're going to come in on. So I think a lot of that has to do with it. In terms of nationally, Penn State still has 9 commitments, which is it ranks right up there. You have the numbers in front of you. Only Oregon has more in the top 15. Now in the rankings, only 5 of them count right now. That'll continue to roll out and continue to get more extensive as we go on. It's a math game, so it's above our heads. But yeah, Penn State sort of less than usual in February. This
but
spring,
on
I
pace,
can see a couple. Yeah, you keep putting people into buckets where it's like, okay, maybe you do have official visits set up, but I don't see this guy, Caden Gebhardt, for example. I don't see him getting 2 official visits, even though he's got a couple of set up. I think that there's a certain level of, or a certain amount of guys that are just going to get tired of it, really. Like you got the spring evaluation period coming up April, visits in April, visits in March for spring practices. A lot of these guys go on spring break and, hit 2 or 3 schools along the way. It's been one of those things for the last several years where if you're going to take a swing, at least in this way, you're probably going to see Michigan. You're probably going to see Ohio State. You might see Notre Dame on that same swing in spring. So those guys will pop up, and we're gonna see where position sort of initiative will come along. You're looking at, you got a corner, you've got 3 wide receivers, you've got 1 edge, we've got a safety, you got a quarterback, you got a running back, and you've got an offensive lineman in this class. There's not much variance in terms of nobody's getting shut out at a position right now. And I think guys have seen that and coaches have seen that. And if you squeeze at the wrong time, if you tell a kid that he's not going to have a spot for much longer, probably going to rub the kid the wrong way. He's not going to have a spot anyway, or not going to take the spot anyway.
Right. Yeah. It feels like this is an interesting class where we talked about the excitement early being a guy like Kevin Brown and Messiah Mickens, putting those guys kind of in a Cooper Cousins bucket of they committed so early in their recruiting cycle that they have been a part of this class. And Penn State did work with a guy like Troy Hune, Matt Sieg, those 4 to start. In years past, we've seen Penn State have 2. And then they get guys in February, and then that kind of like trickle happens, less so than while you and I and Ryan are working on the class of 2025, and I'm trying to keep up with all the different things going on there. And suddenly, oh, by the way, Kevin Brown, who's potential 5-star, is committing as well. And it's just like, it's a throw the paper in the air sort of situation for trying to keep everything straight. But here now, in this particular time period in February, maybe some of those guys would have made that decision. They just made it earlier, is kind of how this class and the nature of this feels to me. And
going back to the negotiation aspect of it, like Penn State's not talking big numbers with guys right now. Like there's no need in February to sort of pin yourself down as this is where we want to come in at. And there's really interesting back and forth between 2 sides right now, because there's no necessity to get a deal done, whether you want to commit in February or April. I don't think there's like a sense of urgency that is going to crush you and make you lose a spot. Whereas Penn State's like, hey, if we can get this thing as far as we can get without talking money, that bodes well for Penn State. Like you find the type of kids that are interested in the type of things that guys have always come to Penn State for. And that's where you find the base of your team, basically the guys that you look at and you say, okay, well, that kid's probably going to end up at Penn State. There will be negotiations. There will be guys that they miss out on late, like last year with Lex Cyrus, last year with Brendan Finney and things like that, and the things that we went through in the summer. But at the same time, it's going to not squeeze both sides, if that makes sense. Like, why get in a bit? Like if you're on eBay and you see something that has 6 days left on it, why put a bid in? Why get yourself? Why drive the price up on yourself, basically?
Yeah. It's interesting how that is kind of changing the timeline of all of this stuff. So then typically I feel like Penn State goes in, is half fair to say with their class committed, or at least 12, 13 guys in a class committed going into official visits? Or is that number overestimating? Because it just feels like, there is time in the spring for them to catch up to that number. But then is this going to be an even more intense May and June in terms of official visits, and then July in terms of commitments, because of that NIL procedure of having to not kick the can down the road, but, give yourself that negotiating window like you talked about?
Yeah, because you get into official visits and you get those guys around other players at their position. And that's sort of when the jockeying happens. That's when you can start putting a little bit more pressure on and start figuring out. Everybody wants to know who the top target is at this position. Well, the top target might be 4 or 5 guys at this point. Like it is basically a tier system where you find yourself in sometimes it's obvious, but when you find yourself looking at this big group and saying, I'm pretty happy with anyone here. And they've gotten some really good players by taking that approach. So I'm very curious how that's going to work out. But yeah, I think a little bit more activity in May and June. I think you're going to get a batch of guys that makes sense before official visits happen. And you're going to see guys added to that May 31st weekend, which is the commit weekend this year, and then go from there. But I think that's when the churn really starts to happen. And again, why would you put yourself in a situation where you're bidding against numbers that you don't know are real? This happened recently. They found themselves sort of trying to counter and coming back. And the prospect came back with a number that was like, "You sure about that?" And sure enough, it was not the real number from the other program. These coaches talk, these collectives talk sometimes, and it's very interesting to watch the dynamics of trying to get the squeeze from the other end, because it's so far or for so long it's been the school just kind of putting the nails to the kid. Now the kid, their representation, whatever that may be, is sort of fighting back, and it's cool from a player empowerment standpoint. But at the same time, it ain't gonna work. It ain't gonna work. So very, very curious to see how that plays out, especially in June and July, which are going to be very active once again.
Which is a great transition to talk about the OV schedule, the official visit schedule for 2026, as we've sprinkled in throughout the show some of the names that have made these official visits. As we've talked about the class of 2026, it is going to be part of this conversation of when this class is decided. So if you don't leave from the recruiting show, because the story continually updates and they're going to find players and we're going to highlight different offers and things like that. But some of the guys we haven't talked about just yet, and I want to bring him up because you said set him aside for a moment, but he does have an official visit to Penn State right now. Emmanuel Ihenacho, who is a 345-pound, 6'6" offensive lineman. The thing I found interesting, I mean, look at that. That's going to get everyone very excited. He's at St. Francis now. So he transferred to St. Francis, as far as I saw on his, I believe, or did he transfer out of? Because that was on his huddle, that St. Francis was his school. So just want to double check that now that I am doing. You
now
should
that
see
I'm talking
Fitz's
on the fly. No, he's still at Georgetown Prep, as far as I know. He went to St. Francis for a short period of time. I don't know if he was out there or not, but he went there to St. Francis on a short period of time, and I think he realized that wasn't the fit for him. Georgetown Prep and St. Francis, you don't get much different. So I think that he wanted a step up in football competition. He's a good student. His parents want him to have the best education possible. But this is a situation where you sort of blown by the education aspect of it, because this guy is going to be so coveted. He can go anywhere he wants. And the backside of that is you can get a really good education if you put your mind to it wherever you want to go. So, and that's what's interesting to me when you talk about Ihenacho, because he's clearly interested in Penn State, loves Phil Troutwine, likes what Penn State did with Olu Fashanu. I think all those things fit. But at the same time, like, if this is going to be a 7-figure player, which it looks like he probably could be, how does that work with what Penn State likes to do? How does that work with what Penn State can do? And how does that work with an offensive lineman? Because this guy is massive, absolutely massive. But is he a guy that plays right away? T. Frank, you have him as a guard.
I'm looking at the way he moves, and I think if you put him next to a Penn State tackle, that is a devastating combination. But if he's talking about Olu Fashanu and he's talking about playing tackle and he's getting tackle money and you're playing him at guard, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So
it also doesn't make a whole lot of sense when you take a look at he might be ready to go when he gets to campus. But if you're going to pay a guy $1 million, you want to hope that he can go right away. Because I'm looking at Samson Okunlola. Some people remember that name. He was a 5-star in the class of 2023, went down to Miami. He was a big ticket item back in the day, 3 cycles ago. He has played in, I think, 12 games in 2 years. So it's not necessarily a situation where, and we talked about this with Malachi Goodman last summer, you gotta figure out the best way for these offensive linemen. And when you are going to take 2 years, 3 years to get onto the field, how's that going to work with the investment that you put in up front? And that is fascinating to me, because you see what guys, Pete Nikos wrote a story about it on 103 this week. You see what guys are going to go for in the portal as offensive linemen, and you want to get ahead of that by developing your own offensive lineman, so you don't have to pay $1 million for an offensive lineman. Well, if the high school offensive lineman costs $1 million, what do? I don't know. There's no right no right answer for this. And Penn State typically not the bidding war type. I think they would expand their parameters for a guy like Ihenacho, and I think that they probably would have to meet in the middle a little bit. And if you've got offers to not meet in the middle with Georgia and all these other places that he's going to check out, like that's going to be a tough thing to go against. And that's why I put Ihenacho, I put Ali in different buckets here, Because if you're a Penn State fan and you say that this class is not successful without those two, then you're not really trying to understand the situation here. So
you're setting yourself up to be disappointed just because you want to have that. You want to have the full thing without the context. I think is fair.
Yeah, and again, this is not anything new. Like I think this is how you kind of find yourself. I don't know. An awful big part of being a fan on the internet is setting yourself up for a letdown. Like I think that's actually maybe the main thing. So I think that's where that road would lead. If you say that these 2 5-stars are in the region, you need to get them or else. And I don't know that that's the case, because there's a lot of good football players out there that are not going to be ranked in the top 100, 300, 500. So
yeah,
it's going to be very interesting, especially at those positions, which are impact positions. Absolutely. But not necessarily immediate impact positions.
Yeah, it's an investment in the future. But if you're spending most of your money investing in the future in a sport now where reloading is, going back to our conversation about what words are appropriate, you don't have time to rebuild if you're Penn State football. You are no longer in the business of we are rebuilding. Every year is a reload. It's a retooling so that you are ready to compete for a college football playoff spot at a bare minimum. That's the expectation now. With the money they're investing into the program, you can't have like every 4 years we're competing. It is an every year thing you're in the playoff. That's the expectation. And Alan here says, just quickly. Okay. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I just want to say about Iheanacho. Awesome kid who I think all things equal would be a Penn State guy. Like he would follow in the footsteps of Olu. He would be in there. It's not his fault that he is in demand this much. Like,
yep.
At some point, like you can be a great dude and still take the money because it's available to you. And I think that that's something to look at here. It's not a situation.
It's almost irresponsible not to, if all things are equal and then the money is greater in one area. Generational money when you're 18 years old is not a situation even the majority of football players get. And so like to just not throw that away, but to not take that opportunity is just like you are also, if you're a parent, you're not doing the best job for setting your son up for success. If you're like, oh, the money doesn't matter. Money absolutely matters. Everyone in this chat knows that you would take $1 million immediately, very few questions asked.
Yeah, no, that'd be great. I'd love $1 million.
I would too.
But also like, it's kind of what Zion Ali said a couple weeks ago when he was down at the Super Bowl thing, I think it was, where he was like, I'm going to get mine no matter where I go. Like, and I think that's honestly refreshing because it's absolutely how that's going to work. Like if he's going to, and maybe one school pulls out and says, I'm not doing it, whether that's because of budgetary reasons or just like, they don't want that on their conscience or whatever. I don't know.
Yeah.
He's still going to have a tremendous amount of options who are probably going to pay him about the same. So I think that that's a very interesting point by him. I'm going to stop short of calling it poignant, but it's one of those things where we put ourselves in this situation where this is the game. And, I see a lot of people implying they're bad kids for taking money or trying to have or maximize their opportunity here. And that's not necessarily the case. Like I said, Emmanuel Iheanacho is awesome kid, great student, a lot to like. So, I mean, it's just one of those product of the system.
I wanted to highlight 2 more players as new names, at least for me, in this conversation. We'll start at running back with Stan Drayton on the staff now. I don't know if these 2 things are related, but Javari Barnett. Did I see a lot of things I like from Javari Barnett? I don't know if that's the right highlights there. I apologize. Running back from Florida. What do you know about him? I'm going to pull them up in a different way, so I apologize.
Yeah, Javari Barnett has been a target for Penn State for a long time, and he's a guy that sort of fits what they've been able to do. I saw it earlier in the chat, and I couldn't find it when I was scrolling up real quick, but I don't think there was a body type or a sort of prototype of what Jaywan Sider liked. It's just find a good running back and make it work. So I think that Javari Barnett looks like a really good running back who could make it work here. So I don't see a fundamental shift from Sider to Drayton. And on top of that, Stan's been at Temple for the last couple of years. So he hasn't been wading in these waters where Penn State is recruiting running backs. When you talk about Florida, you talk about very, very general terms, Florida recruiting. okay, this guy's in Tampa. That's very different than Miami. It's different than Orlando. It's different than Jacksonville. It's different than the Panhandle. We mentioned the safety from Caden Hall a little bit earlier. Very different areas of Florida. I don't think Penn State's going to be shut out in Tampa. I think it's going to be a typical Florida recruitment. Now, does that mean Stan Drayton's there? Does that mean Terry Smith, who's been prevalent in Florida? A couple other coaches have been around there. I think it's a very much a team effort there. So I don't think much changes in terms of running back recruiting. I think that there's a certain batch of kids that are at Penn State's level, that are also at Georgia's level, that are also at Notre Dame's level, that are also at all these other top schools' levels. And I think you're going to continue to see that group pick from that group. And I think that that's overblown in terms of how much it changes running back recruiting from coach to coach. I guess
it seems like they've reached that threshold, right? That they want to get to at other positions where they're valuable. They've invested the time and the resources to get the talent on the roster and on the team, and they have maintained a certain level of prestige with Stan Drayton that you didn't take a step back in any way necessarily, at least from a Bijan Robinson. Everyone's talking about like all the things that Stan Drayton has done over his career.
Yeah, I think the big thing there would be he doesn't have these relationships forged, and we're a couple of months, maybe a year into the cycle. So like I think that is where it could hurt them, but it also could help them. It could be a fresh start, be a different thing. You hit it off with Stan Drayton, all of a sudden you feel pretty good about Penn State, and you feel pretty good about this official visit that you got set up. So I think that plays back into it as well. As I was talking a little bit ago about not giving the guys the credit or having the stigma, we also sometimes give too much credit, because like a new splash that can make all the difference in your recruiting. And we've seen guys that pick up offers in March, pick up offers in, hey, Chaz Coleman picked up his offer in September. Like, yeah, doesn't necessarily matter when it happens, but if you feel comfortable with those people, hey, that could work. So just one of those things where when you cover this stuff year after year, all year round, you try to connect data points, you try to connect logic points. And I think that goes back to Penn State's had a heck of a reputation with running backs. And by the way, they've got the best running back in the NFL right now, who is an incredible marketing tool for you. So Stan Drayton walking into a pretty good situation.
Yeah. Just like in football, adversity and success, they are not desperate things. So today's show, unbelievably successful, seeing as Fitz ran out of power and I ran out of highlights, and we got here to the end of the show. We got here to the end of the week. This is the final show here on our live segment for Blue White Illustrated, the BWI live show. Of course, we'll have more content here on the YouTube channel throughout the weekend, some replays, some recaps, and of course, if there's any breaking news or commitments, anything that falls from the sky, Fitz is going to have it first at bluewhiteillustrated.com, and then we'll have breaking news here on the YouTube channel. That's how the rhythm of all this works, which is why if you want the full shebang, you got to subscribe to bluewhiteillustrated.com. It is just $1 for a week for a year. So you can do the math of how many weeks there are in a year and how much you're actually going to pay. That is the best deal you can find for us that we've put out in a very, 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 very long time, because we want you to join us and we want you to get the inside information so you can have both sides of the conversation. The one we have here with context and nuance and intrigue and some laughs along the way. And then, of course, all the information at bluewhiteillustrated.com. Fitz, thanks again for being on the show today. We will be back next week. Tuesday is BWI Live. We'll talk to you then.